Quebec City is one of the oldest European settlements in all of North America, and 1541 would see French explorer Jacques Cartier arrive here and establish Fort Charlesbourg, but would be abandoned less than 1 year later, of all things, due to a harsh winter. Now, July of 1608 would see the father of New France, Samuel de Champlain, arrive here, and 1 decade later he would establish Fort Champlain. Now, the fort would be replaced in 1628 by the Chateau St. Louis, and would continue to grow and expand over a century later until 1750, where it looked something like this. Quebec was the prize for all the European settlers, and the French would hold it until 1759 during the Battle of Quebec, where the British, led by General James Wolfe, would capture the city just steps away from today's Chateau Frontenac, here on the Plains of Abraham. Now, 1834 would see the Chateau St. Louis catch fire and be reduced just to a pile of rubble. And 4 years later, in 1838, the city would build a terrace over top of the ruins, and that terrace was enlarged half a century later in 1879 into what we now know today as the Dufferin Terrace, named after the Governor-General of Canada at the time, Lord Dufferin. Now, if we go back a decade, 1867 saw John A. Macdonald lead Confederation to form what we now know today as Canada. But 1873 would see him voted out of power in favor of Alexander Mackenzie. But 5 years later, in 1878, he would run a bold promise. He would campaign to build a transcontinental railway to unite Canada and finally get BC to join Confederation. And spoiler alert, he won. The Canadian Pacific Railway would win the contract and forge this route west and see completion in 1885 in Craigellachie, BC, just outside of Revelstoke. This here is Cornelius Van Horn. He was the general manager of the Canadian Pacific at the time, and his vision was to draw tourists to experience the untouched beauty of Canada. He envisioned a network of railway hotels across the country along his route, from the Banff Springs to Mount Stephen House and Field, or even Glacier House just outside of Revelstoke. And they all saw a lot of success. And by this time, Quebec City was in the midst of a restoration project to restore the city back to its 17th century look. And when the idea of constructing a railway hotel on the site of the former Chateau St. Louis became popular, Van Horn, he was all over it. With his Canadian Pacific steamships docking down below coming across from Europe, and a railway stretching from Quebec City all the way to the Pacific, Quebec was the perfect location. They would break ground on this new hotel in 1892, and the hotel opened 1 year later on December 18th of 1863. And the hotel would be named the Chateau Frontenac, named after the former Governor-General of New France. This guy, his name is Louis, his full name is almost unpronounceable, but he was better known as Governor-General Frontenac, and the hotel, it was named after him. And the chateau itself was straight out of a fairy tale. I mean, towers topped with turret wings, gables, dormer windows, tall chimneys, and that signature high-pitched roof. The locals absolutely adored it, and so did the rest of the world. And the hotel was so popular that it would expand several times, including the first happening here in 1868, which would stretch the hotel back up the plains, and a decade later in 1909, the hotel would expand again, adding a new wing to the back of the hotel, but the most famous addition would happen in 1919. The construction of the new central tower had begun. Now, the original goal was to continue the expansion backwards, but the Canadian Pacific had completely run out of real estate, and the only expansion was going up. This central tower would increase the room total from 198 to over 600 rooms. And I think that this may hands down be the most beautiful piece of architecture I have ever seen in my life. The French chateau-style architecture absolutely towering above the city, looking down on the Plains of Abraham and the St. Lawrence River below. It is so obvious to me, right here, why this would instantly become the most photographed hotel in the world from this point onward. I mean, the design is so admired in Canada, it's even on the face of the famous Celebration butter cookies here in Canada. And the central tower was not only jaw-dropping beautiful, but it would make the Chateau Frontenac not just the tallest building in the city, but in the entire province, at over 257 meters high. That was until a couple years later in 1930, when the Price Building, this one right here, would surpass it at only 10 meters taller. Now, the Great Depression and World War I were a bit of a scary time in Canada, to say the least. Passenger rail service was grinding to a halt, but in Quebec City here in 1926, the hotel would catch fire, but thankfully it started on the exterior of the hotel, which was made completely of stone, and although it looked pretty bad, it was pretty much exclusive damage to the front of the hotel and the exterior, and safe to say the chateau bounced back pretty quickly. And over the next century up until today, the hotel has played an incredible role to draw tourists to Quebec through the passenger station, which they built in 1915 and is pretty much a spitting image of Vancouver's second waterfront station, as you see here. And that station was named Gare de Palais, which is the French term for the station, and would serve passengers until 1976. It would close down for almost a decade and finally reopen again in 1985. And although the station today only hosts 3 tracks for trains instead of the original 12, with at most 5 departures a day, to be honest, it's just nice to have passenger service because this is how we will be leaving Quebec City later on in this video. Now, the year 2000 would see the hotel rebranded as Fairmont, and fast forward to today, that brings us to here in the spring of 2025 for 2 nights inside the most photographed hotel on Earth.